The Ghost Night Bus, London's most haunted road. The red double-decker came out of the fog like a storm. It was 1:15 in the morning, and the road was empty except for the one car that hit the bend too fast. Headlights cut long white knives through the mist. Then, through that bright slice, a bigger light burned, two round, fierce headlights high above, and the glossy red side of a bus like a wall rushing toward them. People who tell the story later say the sound was the worst part, not a normal engine, but a low, rolling thunder that seemed to shake your teeth. Then the bus was beside the car, close enough to see empty seats through the top windows, curtains moving though there was no wind. No driver. No one on the lower deck. Just the hard, bright face of Route 7, painted in cracked letters above the windshield, last run. A van swerved. A pickup flipped. A small sedan spun and hit the hedge. The crash was ugly and quick. Tires screamed, glass jumped like small stars, and a child's doll landed on the wet hood of one car and sat there, one glass eye staring up at the fog. Witnesses later said they felt the bus pass through them, like the whole world had leaned to one side. When anyone looked back, there was nothing, only fog folding over the road, the small pieces of the accident, and the smell of burned rubber. The bus had gone. Or maybe it had never been there at all. People who lived near that curve, the old bend in Cambridge Gardens, learned to watch the clock at night. They stopped staying out after the church bells. They closed curtains and whispered the time to each other. For years, the same story was told. On foggy nights, at exactly 1:15 a.m., a bright red double-decker would scream down the street. It would race toward the sharp curve where the road bent and dropped. It would appear empty. It would pass, and then an accident would follow. Sometimes people walked away bruised and shaken. Sometimes they did not walk away at all. At first, the newspapers called it a coincidence. Engineers measured the curve with rulers and maps. The council argued about signs and speed limits. They added warnings, painted stripes, and put up lamps. But the crashes kept happening. Drivers swore their hands had felt the bus press at their doors. A schoolteacher said she watched the top deck through the fog and saw a small pale hand tap the streetlight 3 times, like a slow clock. A baker said he swerved to miss the bus and later found a dent in his truck that didn't match any other vehicle. A policeman wrote in his notebook, "Tracks begin wide then end as if heavy thing leapt from road." The paper printed the officer's handwriting with the headline, "Mystery Bus?" Locals rolled their eyes at the headlines and then looked at the clock at 1:10 and felt the hair on their arms stand up. The oldest people in town remembered the first night the bus was seen. It was the winter of 1938. Lights were softer in those days. People wrapped in coats walked with their heads down. In photographs from that winter, lampposts glow like small moons and men in hats look like dark shapes. That is when the first reports were written down. A driver called in from his route and said simply, "A bus, red, no driver." The council minutes from January 1939 read like a dry list of accidents, and a plan to fix the road. There was no place for ghosts in those pages. But the people who lived here, the ones who kept warm in small kitchens while fog drifted across their windows, did not read the minutes for answers. They read each other's faces. After a handful of wrecks and one terrible night when a young man died in the ditch, the council did something big. They reshaped the road. Hedgerows were pulled back. The curve was eased. The lane was widened. Men in trucks moved earth like they wanted to change the world. A sign was painted in loud white letters, "Slow, sharp bend." It looked new and brave under the lamps. After the work, something changed. The crashes slowed and the top of night stories faded. People relaxed. They began to believe that washing a road in fresh paint and flattening a curve could wash the old danger away too. For a while, Cambridge Gardens slept better. But stories do not disappear like smoke. They live longer than paint and concrete. Old-timers told the tale with a soft smile and a warning. Don't stay out after the bells. At the pub, men banged their knuckles on the bar when they told it. Mothers told children to be home by 1. Schoolkids dared each other to stand at the bend at night and watch the fog. The plaque on the pub wall read Route 7, last run, do not forget, became a joke and a prayer all at once. And still, once in a while, someone said they saw a red light slice the fog, far off and moving like a memory. The pattern had a cruel rhythm. Even after the road was reshaped, there were late accidents. They were fewer, but they did not stop. A truck driver in 2003 told his story for the radio. He hit a slick patch, a flash of red passed his window, he woke in the ditch. He said he had seen empty seats in the top row. A night nurse remembered a bus gliding past her house at the same time each week for a month, and then one night it did not come. She kept a report folded in a drawer for years, then burned it. People said the bus got what it wanted and went away. The bus seemed to follow a schedule. 1:15 a.m. was the heartbeat. The more people remembered, the stronger the bus's rhythm felt. Memory, the older folks said, can be its own kind of engine. A ghost is not always a thing. Sometimes it is a story that runs so often it becomes habit. If a place remembers a danger enough, the danger keeps returning. Still, some details refused explanation. Why a double-decker? Why no driver? Why a dull, tapping hand on the top deck? Why a child's doll left in the road like a signal? When the documentary men came years later with cameras and lights, they found old photographs and grainy film. One black and white clip from the 1940s showed a smear of red in fog that no lab could explain away. Witnesses told their tales on tape. An old sergeant, his voice dry from years of service, said he once stood at the bend and watched tracks that stopped as if the machine had leapt up out of the world. A woman who had lost her brother in a crash said she had dreamed the bus since she was a girl. It taps the lamp, she said softly in the interview, like it is counting how many nights are left. The town split into two camps. Some called it folklore, a way to make sense of too many tragedies. Some called it a haunting. Others, tired of fear, called it nonsense and told newcomers not to be silly. But the stories do not ask for agreement. They only move through people like weather. When the fog came, old words pushed up through new ones. For many years the bus stayed the stuff of whispers and pub talk. Then, in a dusty back room at the Historical Society, a box was opened. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, lay a cassette tape and a small photograph. The photograph showed the bend before the repairs, a raw, dangerous curve, and faintly blurred in the background, a shape that could be a double-decker. The cassette had a handwritten date on it, November 5, 1972. In the tape's case, someone had written only 1:15 a.m. They played the tape on the old player in the society's meeting room, and the sound came out thin and crackling. A man's voice, close and hurried, said, "It's coming. Fog is thick." There was a slam, like a heavy door closing, and then a roar that filled the room and made the hair on the back of every listener's neck stand up. The recording cut to static. After it was over, everyone in the room sat very still. The tape was small, but it felt like a message. No one knew who had recorded that voice. No name was on the cassette. The photograph and tape were the kind of small, sharp evidence that brings the past into a room and refuses to let anyone forget. People started to talk again, the old fear pushing at the new peace. Some said the tape proved the bus was real. Others said someone had made the recording to scare the town. But the image of the door slamming and the roar in the tape was too vivid to ignore. The Historical Society put a notice on the board and the town council found the old police notes about the 1938 accidents. The plaques and the bar stories found new ears. Teenagers dared one another to walk the bend at night and record what they heard. Old men smoked their pipes on porches and fixed their eyes on the street clock. The bus's schedule, quiet for decades, started knocking in the back of memory again. People began to keep their children close after midnight. One night, someone found the doll from the old stories. It lay half buried in the hedgerow near the bend, its face caked with mud and missing an arm. A small, neat note was pinned to its dress. The note had only one line, written in faded ink, "We keep our schedule." Someone took the note to the station. The sergeant read it with fingers that did not shake. He looked out the window toward the bend. The fog was thin that night, only a light mist, and the clock in the square read 1:12 a.m. People across the town checked their watches. In kitchens and living rooms, curtains twitched. At 1:14 some lamps were turned off. At 1:15, a rooster would have crowed somewhere far away in a dream, and a bus that should not exist would make its last run. On doorsteps, in small lights, people waited. The night held its breath. Then, a sound like a great door closing echoed down the lane. The tape slam, the photographs blur, the doll's note, everything seemed to answer at once. For a moment the whole town felt a single, cold heartbeat. The last thing anyone heard before the fog swallowed the sound was a voice, thin and distant, but real enough to strangle a smile, whisper a name. The chapter ends with that name hanging in the mist, and the town listening for the sound that would come next. The name hung in the fog like a bell that would not stop ringing. It was a simple name, the kind you might call out in a house when you want someone to come to dinner. For a moment, no one moved. Windows stayed shut. A dog 3 streets away pushed at its chain and then quieted. The town clock ticked once, slow and heavy. People who heard the whisper later could not agree on the syllables. Some said it was a man's name. Others said it sounded like a child. The sound did not last long. It drifted away as if the wind had stolen it. But it had done something worse than vanish. It had put a question into the night: who had the bus been calling? By morning, the town had a new rumor. At the little cafe on the corner, where the walls were covered in old pictures and the cook always knew what you wanted, a group of regulars sat with their coffee and passed the name from lip to lip like a secret rapper. Maybe it was the man from the tape, one said. Maybe it was a ghost's way of remembering a face, said another. They spoke quietly, because the name had a sharpness to it that felt almost like the edge of a memory. Margaret Ellis walked to the Bend at noon with 2 folding chairs and a thermos. She had a face like an old book, every line a story. People call her when they want to know what the town used to be. She sat and looked at the road the way someone looks at an old photograph. Names have power, she said, stirring her tea with a spoon that clicked. When you say a name at night, sometimes it answers back. Not always with a body or a face, but with something that remembers. The town council held a short meeting that afternoon. They put the photograph and the tape on a table and watched as the mayor, a cautious man with a tie that never loosened, frowned. Engineers promised to check the road again. The police said they would search the hedges and the ditches. A small group of volunteers agreed to walk the Bend at midnight for a week, taking flashlights and cameras and calling each other on the walkie-talkies they had bought for safety. That night, the volunteers gathered under a thin rain. The mist came on slow feet and took the town's edges away. They walked in a line with their lights scanning. Their radios crackled with jokes at first, and then the jokes dried up. The tape's roar, played again and again in the police station, had taught them to listen for sounds that did not belong. At 1:12 a.m. a young volunteer named Tom clicked his recorder to life and whispered into it like a man in church. "If anything happens, we'll get it on tape," he said. They laughed quietly because laughing is easier than being afraid. At 1:14 they stopped breathing with the world. The mist pressed against their jackets. A streetlight blinked. Then, at 1:15 a.m., a low sound rose from the Bend. It was not loud at first. It was a small rolling note, like a drum far away. Then it grew, and the volunteers felt a pressure in their chests the way a train pressurizes an underground tunnel. A red light moved through the fog like a dropped ember. It was far, but it was coming, and even the men who had mocked the story felt their hands tighten on their torches. They ran forward. One of the women, Lucy, tripped and grabbed a hedge to stop herself. Something scraped her palm as she reached. She felt a sticky wetness and then a small, hard object cut into her fingers. She forgot to scream. The others pulled her back and shone their lights down. It was a child's bracelet, silver and old, with a tiny charm shaped like a star. It had been buried for a while. Someone handed it to the sergeant who had come down to watch. He kept it in his pocket like a talisman. The red light flashed past them, high and terrible, and the volunteers saw, for just a second, the top deck windows empty and the curtains shifting like a mouth. They saw the bus's brass letters read Route 7, last run. The roar filled their chests and then, just as suddenly, it was gone. Their breaths steamed out in white clouds and then the fog swallowed them. The tape that night had recorded something. When Tom played it back the next day in the station, his voice sounded thin and distant on the speaker, and then the rolling sound came. But at 1:15 the recording caught something else, a voice, not loud but close, that said one short word. It was not the name from the night before. It was a word that sounded like a direction. The sergeant listened and then rubbed his jaw. "We need to find where that voice came from," he said. He meant a person, a radio, a prank. He did not mean a ghost. The men at the table nodded because saying ghost out loud makes things harder to fix. They searched the hedges, the ditches, the back gardens of houses along the bend. They checked drains and old foundations. They looked under bridges and behind the memorial plaque at the pub. They followed every silly teenage rumor, every old map scribble, every line drawn on paper. They found small things, a bent bicycle wheel, a cracked headlight, a rusted lunchbox. They found footprints that led to nowhere. They found nothing that explained the voice. 2 nights later, a journalist from a city paper arrived with a camera and a calm face. She wanted a story about how small towns make big ghosts from small things. She interviewed Margaret and the sergeant, and a retired bus driver who said he had once seen something red in the fog himself, when he was young. "Old birds make old nests," the driver said. "Once a place is full of a thing, that thing returns." The journalist's editor wanted a line that would make readers click. He asked whether the town believed in curses. But the people of Cambridge Gardens were not dramatic. They told the truth in small, quiet pieces. They told about the doll in the mud and the bracelet in the hedge, and the tape that had no owner. The journalist left with a notebook full of sentences that would not fit together into one neat truth. A week later there was another small discovery. A boy walking his dog on a Saturday morning found a leather-bound book half buried near the bend. It was a small book, the kind that used to belong to a bus conductor who kept tickets in a pocket. The cover had letters stamped into it that had almost faded away. Inside, in careful handwriting, were entries that looked like a log, times written in the margin, short notes like "late" and "fog," and a name written more than once. The book smelled of dust and coal smoke. The handwriting stopped on a page where the ink had bled into a smear, as if something wet had fallen on it. Above the smear someone had written, in a shaky hand, the words, "Last run, don't forget." That night the town turned its lights down as if to listen better. Parents called their children inside early. The mayor sent a message to the council asking for help from nearby towns. The documentary crew that had begun filming returned with a sound man and a camera crane. They wanted to get footage of the bend at night the way it looked now, safe and ordinary. When they set up, they placed microphones in the hedges and ran cables across the grass like spiderwebs. At 1:14 the sound man whispered into his headset, and his voice came back from the earpiece like a ghost. The cameras rolled. The crew's faces were pale in the monitor glow. Then, at 1:15, the microphones captured something that would make the footage impossible to explain away as a prank. The rolling noise rose, and the camera lenses fogged like breathing glass. A pair of red lights bloomed in the mist. The crane caught the shape of the bus cutting through fog, but when the image went to the big screen and the director paused and zoomed, something more terrible showed, a shadow standing at the edge of the curve, looking straight toward the camera. The figure stood perfectly still. It was tall and thin and wore a coat that looked like it had been out of fashion for decades. It had a hat pulled down low. The camera zoomed and the figure raised a hand, not a wave, but a small, slow motion like pointing to the road. The sound man's headset filled with a thin whisper. The whisper said the same word the volunteers' tape had caught, the little direction word, and then the voice seemed to break into the roar. "Play it back," the director ordered in a voice that tried to be steady. They played the clip. The whisper hummed through the monitors. It did not say a human name. It said a place. The camera zoomed in beyond what felt possible, and for a blink a small thing moved on the top deck. A hand, pale and quick, tapped the metal of the railing once, twice. The sound on the playback was tiny but clear. The hand moved like it was counting. The director put a palm over his mouth and sat back as if someone had knocked the air from him. The clip spread fast. People who had not left town watched it on the internet and felt something cold in their chests. Journalists called it a hoax or a great piece of editing. Skeptics tore the footage down frame by frame and argued about pixels and reflections. But the sergeant who had been there said simply, "I was there. I saw it. That hand was not a trick." On the third night after the footage came out, the rain returned and the fog grew thick again. A woman who had lost her brother at the bend in earlier years came to stand by the fence. She held a photograph of him that had yellowed at the edges. She whispered his name into her cupped hands and then looked up at the road. A small child stood beside her, holding her mother's glove, eyes wide. At 1:14 the child pointed. Something red moved like paint across paper, and the sound rose. The woman put her hand to her mouth. The buzz passed in a roar that filled the valley and made the teacups on porches clink like bones. For a moment the top deck curtains shuffled and a pale hand tapped the lamppost. 3 taps, steady as time. The woman's lips pressed together. She said nothing. When the roar died and the fog closed, the child was gone. People screamed and shined their lights into the hedges and called the child's name like a bell. The woman fell to her knees and grabbed the dirt and wept. The sergeant ran with a flashlight to where the child had last stood. He looked back at the small footprints that ended in the soft mud like someone had lifted a foot into the air and never put it down. The bread truck driver who had been passing that night swore he had seen the child on the top deck, looking down with a small pale face and pressed hands on the rail. Others said they had glimpsed a tiny shoe falling into the fog. No one had answers. The cameras had caught a thing that could not be explained and then turned away when the real, sharp terror arrived. The town that had learned to keep its children in at 1 in the morning had never learned to hold them in its heart. Now it had to learn fast. The broadcast vans left their engines running like beasts ready to run. The director who had shouted the order to play the tapes sat in a folding chair and stared at the screen until the light from it burned blue in his face. The sergeant covered the child's mother with his coat and promised he would not stop. He meant it in the way men mean small promises when they have nothing else. The bus had come and done something. It had taken a child in a moment thick as fog. It had moved on, leaving a wet shoe and a hole that was not only in the ground. The watch on the sergeant's wrist read 1:18 a.m. The town felt like a hand that had been closed too hard and then let go. The camera on the crane kept running, and on the far edge of the footage, almost hidden in mist, a single framed window opened at the top of the bus. A pale face leaned toward the glass and smiled. Then the image wavered and the feed cut to static. People say the fog keeps things. That night it kept a child. And something in that kept world had waited a long time for a name to be called and a schedule to be kept. The sergeant stood and raised his radio to his mouth. He said nothing at first. Then his voice came out small and raw. "We find that child," he said. "We find them, whatever it takes." The fog swallowed his words. The bus's last run faded into the distance with a deep, slow clank like a door being closed behind a train. The monitors showed the last frame again and again until everyone in the room knew the shape of the pale face. Outside, the town held its breath and waited for the next sound. The night was not done. The schedule was not finished. The search went on for days. Police combed the bend and the woods beyond it, dogs barking into fog so thick it felt like breath. News vans rolled in from the city. They set up lights, cables, and cameras, but the mist refused to be filmed. It swallowed the glow and gave nothing back. The missing child's name was on every tongue, whispered in prayer, repeated on the evening broadcasts, written on cardboard signs stuck to fences. People stayed indoors at night. Curtains closed early. The cafe shut its doors before midnight. But even with lights off and radios silent, everyone in Camden Gardens listened. They waited for the sound that had always meant trouble. At 1:15 a.m., 3 nights after the disappearance, the bus returned. The sound started low, a hum beneath the skin, the kind of vibration that makes your heart forget its rhythm. Then came the roar. Houses shook, and window panes trembled. The fog turned a dull red. Those who were awake said they saw the double-decker surge down the road again, headlights blazing like two moons. It took the bend perfectly, not a wobble, not a swerve, as if it knew every inch of the street better than any living driver. But this time, there was something different. The curtains on the top deck were open. Behind the glass, faint shapes could be seen, rows of pale faces, all turned toward the windows. Passengers. Dozens of them. Their eyes were dark, empty circles. And in the very front seat, pressed against the window, was the small shape of a child. People froze in doorways and behind curtains. No one ran into the street. No one even screamed. The bus moved through the fog, gliding like it was made of smoke and metal and memory. As it passed the lamppost at the bend, a hand reached out again, the same pale hand witnesses had seen for decades, and tapped the metal pole 3 times. Tap. 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 And then silence. The bus didn't crash, didn't vanish suddenly. It simply faded, its red glow dimming until the fog was gray again. When the air cleared, the road was empty. No tire marks. No sound. Nothing. The child's mother was there that night. She walked into the road long after the fog had gone, her shoes wet with dew. In the middle of the lane, where the light from the lamppost fell, she found a small silver bracelet, the one the volunteers had discovered days before. She picked it up, and inside the tiny star charm was a single folded paper note. She opened it with shaking fingers. It read, "Schedule complete." That was the last sighting of the Ghost Night bus. After that night, the accident stopped. The fog still came, but the road was quiet. The city resurfaced the asphalt a year later, adding a second lane, and traffic signs replaced the old lamppost. Tourists came to see London's most haunted road, but the locals stayed inside. They had seen enough. Margaret Ellis, who had lived through every rumor, every whisper, and every newspaper headline, told her final version of the story years later to a documentary team. Her voice was soft, almost kind. "It never wanted to hurt people," she said. "It just wanted to finish what it started. Maybe there was a crash once, a long time ago, and that driver never made it home. Maybe he kept driving until someone remembered his name. But we never did. We just feared it, and sometimes fear is enough to keep a ghost alive." The film crew asked her if she still believed the bus would ever return. She smiled a tired smile and shook her head. "Not here," she said. "The road's different now. The past has nowhere left to drive." But as the camera crew packed up and stepped outside her house, the sky began to fog over. The church bells struck 1, slow and heavy. Somewhere far down the road, a low rumble rolled through the mist, distant, faint, like an echo of thunder. They all stopped. For a few seconds, 2 faint red lights glowed deep in the fog. Then, just as quickly, they were gone. The cameraman kept the lens steady, whispering to the sound tech beside him. "Did you hear that?" And through the microphone, buried deep under static, came 3 soft metallic taps. Tap. 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 The screen cuts to black. A single line of white text fades in. To this day, locals still say that when the fog is thick and the night is quiet, you can hear the Ghost Night bus making its last run, forever keeping its 1:15 schedule. Then the sound returns, a distant roar, the squeal of invisible brakes, and one final door closing somewhere out in the dark.